A homeless Navy SEAL bought a $1 candle shop. Then his dog uncovered soldiers buried beneath the floor. After being thrown out by his own family, former Navy SEAL Caleb Mercer drove deep into the frozen Blue Ridge Mountains with nothing left but an old truck and his retired K9, Ghost. When Ghost refuses to leave an abandoned candle shop selling for just $1, Caleb discovers hidden tunnels beneath the floorboards. And a secret this quiet mountain town has buried for over 40 years. Comment 1 if you'd follow your dog into the unknown, or 0 if you'd walk away, and tell us where you're watching from. Rainwater dripped steadily from the edge of the farmhouse roof, tapping against the rusted metal bucket beside the porch like a clock counting down the final seconds of something already dead. Caleb Mercer stood in the muddy front yard, with his military duffel bag hanging from one shoulder, and Ghost sitting silently beside him. The cold Tennessee wind pushed through the dead cornfields behind the house, bending the brittle stalks beneath a gray November sky. Across from him, his younger half-brother Derek leaned against the porch railing, with both hands shoved into the pockets of his expensive hunting jacket. The two men shared the same father, but almost nothing else. Derek had inherited the farm. Caleb had inherited the silence. "You heard the lawyer," Derek said flatly. "Dad left the property to me." Caleb didn't answer immediately. His blue eyes remained fixed on the front door of the farmhouse, the same door he'd walked through as a boy after Little League games, after fishing trips, after church on Sundays before life had slowly cracked apart piece by piece. Now the windows looked empty, like strangers lived there already. Ghost shifted slightly beside him, pressing against Caleb's leg. The German shepherd's black and tan coat rippled in the cold breeze, his alert brown eyes never leaving Derek for long. Derek noticed. "That dog staring at me all day is starting to get old." Ghost's ears twitched. Caleb finally spoke, his voice low and rough from too many years swallowing things he should have said out loud. "He's smarter than most people." Derek laughed once, short and humorless. "There it is, same Caleb Mercer I remember. Thinks everybody's the enemy." Caleb's jaw tightened. Not everybody, just enough people to make it permanent. The rain grew heavier. Somewhere beyond the hills, thunder rolled low across the Tennessee Valley. Derek straightened from the railing and stepped down onto the porch stairs. "You've been back 3 months," he said. 3 months sleeping in Dad's old room, drinking coffee, staring out windows, waking everybody up screaming half the damn night. Caleb looked away. That one landed because it was true. The nightmares had gotten worse since coming home from overseas. Worse since the mission in Syria went sideways. Worse since the helicopter fire and the screams and the radio static ghoul, and the moment he realized 3 men under his command were never coming home. Some nights he woke up reaching for a rifle that wasn't there anymore. Other nights he woke up choking on smoke nobody else could smell. "You think I wanted this?" Caleb asked quietly. Derek shrugged. "I think you came back expecting life to wait for you." The words hit harder than Caleb expected, because maybe some small part of him had. Not the farm itself, not the money, just a place to stand still for a while. Ghost suddenly stood, positioning himself slightly in front of Caleb. Not aggressive, protective. Derek rolled his eyes. "Take the damn dog and go." For a moment, nobody moved. Rain struck the gravel driveway harder now, turning puddles into silver ripples beneath the darkening sky. Then Caleb nodded once. Not because he agreed, because he was tired. Tired in the kind of way sleep never fixed. He turned without another word and walked toward the old pickup truck parked beside the barn. Ghost followed immediately, close enough that his shoulder brushed Caleb's leg every few steps. The truck was a faded blue Ford from the late 90s with peeling paint and a passenger door that only opened from the inside. Their father used to call it stubborn. Caleb tossed the duffel into the truck bed and climbed behind the wheel. For a second, he just sat there, with both hands gripping the steering wheel. The farmhouse lights glowed faintly through the rain. Home. Or what used to be one. Ghost climbed into the passenger seat with practiced ease and settled down heavily. Caleb started the engine. The truck coughed twice before finally turning over. As he pulled away from the farmhouse, he didn't look back again, because soldiers learned early that looking back could get you killed. The roads through eastern Tennessee twisted endlessly through hills stripped bare by late autumn. Fog hung low across the valleys, turning distant trees into dark smudges beneath the storm clouds. The farther Caleb drove, the quieter the world became. Gas station, 2-lane highway, closed diner. Mountain roads curling into the Blue Ridge foothills. Hours blurred together beneath the steady hum of old tires against wet pavement. Ghost slept lightly most of the drive, though every so often one ear twitched toward Caleb whenever the truck drifted too close to the shoulder. "You're the only thing keeping this thing on the road," Caleb muttered. Ghost opened one eye briefly before resting his head back down. By nightfall, Caleb's hands ached from gripping the wheel too tightly. The PTSD always got worse in darkness. Road signs flashing suddenly from the trees, headlights approaching too fast, rain hitting the windshield sounding too much like distant gunfire. Twice he caught himself checking mirrors that didn't matter anymore. Twice he reached toward the empty space beside his seat, where his sidearm used to ride overseas. Ghost noticed every time. The dog would quietly place one paw against Caleb's arm until the shaking stopped. No barking. No panic. Just presence. Like always. Near midnight, Caleb pulled into a nearly abandoned roadside gas station outside Asheville, North Carolina. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead while cold mist drifted through the parking lot. Inside, the cashier barely looked up from his phone. "Pump 3. Caleb nodded silently and handed over crumpled bills from his wallet. When he checked afterward, he had $23 left. That was it. $23 and a quarter tank of gas between him and nowhere. Back in the truck, he leaned his forehead briefly against the steering wheel. Ghost rested his chin on Caleb's shoulder. "You picked the wrong guy to stick with," Caleb whispered. Ghost stared at him steadily. Caleb let out a tired breath through his nose. "Yeah," he murmured. "I know." By dawn, the mountains had changed. The roads narrowed. The forests thickened. Pine trees climbed steep ridges, disappearing into pale morning fog. Somewhere deep in western North Carolina, Caleb passed an old wooden sign nearly swallowed by vines. Briar Glen, population 1,842. The town looked forgotten by time. Old brick storefronts, rusted railroad tracks, a diner with fogged windows, a white church standing against the hills, the kind of place where people still waved from porches and noticed strangers immediately. Caleb drove slowly through town, exhaustion pulling at him harder with every passing block. He needed gas, food, sleep. Maybe all three. But mostly, he needed somewhere nobody knew his name. Then Ghost sat upright instantly. Caleb frowned. "What is it?" The dog stared intensely toward a narrow alley between two old buildings near the abandoned railroad district. Ghost let out a low sound deep in his throat. Not fear. Focus. Caleb slowed the truck. The alley was little more than cracked pavement and overgrown weeds disappearing between rows of neglected buildings. Rusted fire escapes climbed brick walls blackened by decades of rain and coal dust. Ghost stood now, pressing against the passenger door. "You serious?" The dog whined softly. Caleb sighed and turned into the alley. At the very end stood a small limestone building partially hidden behind tangled vines and dead ivy. One window faced the alley, its dusty glass glowing faintly beneath the weak mountain sunlight. The place looked abandoned for decades. Weathered stone walls, collapsed gutters, a crooked wooden sign hanging by one chain. Ghost barked once. Caleb killed the engine slowly. For reasons he couldn't explain, the hairs along the back of his neck stood up. That old feeling returned, the one he used to trust with his life overseas. Something isn't right here. He stepped out of the truck carefully, boots crunching over gravel and broken glass. Ghost immediately moved ahead of him toward the building. The closer Caleb got, the stranger the place felt. Not dangerous, just waiting. The wooden sign creaked softly in the wind. Caleb reached up and brushed dirt away with his sleeve. Faded black letters slowly appeared beneath decades of dust. For sale, $1. Caleb stared at it, then laughed once under his breath. A broken, exhausted sound. $1, he muttered. Ghost stood frozen near the front door, ears forward, eyes locked on the darkness beyond the dirty window. Caleb looked at the dog. Ghost looked back. Then the German shepherd walked to the door and placed one paw against it. Slowly, deliberately, the wind moved softly through the alley behind them. Somewhere far off, a train horn echoed through the mountains, and for the first time in a very long while, Caleb Mercer felt something that wasn't numbness, not hope, not yet, but something close enough to make him stay. Caleb stood motionless in the narrow alley while cold mountain wind drifted between the buildings of Briar Glen. The crooked for sale sign creaked softly overhead, swinging from one rusted chain like it had been waiting years for someone to finally stop beneath it. Ghost remained fixed at the front door of the candle shop. The German shepherd's posture had changed completely. Alert, focused, intent. Caleb had seen that stance before in places far more dangerous than a forgotten mountain town in North Carolina. Ghost used to stand that exact same way before hidden explosives were discovered overseas, before ambushes, before gunfire. The dog trusted instincts more than sight, and Ghost's instincts had saved lives. Caleb slowly approached the weathered door. The limestone walls of the building were stained dark with age, moss creeping through cracks near the foundation. One dusty window faced the alley, clouded so heavily with grime that almost nothing inside could be seen clearly. Ghost sniffed near the bottom of the door. Then he let out a low whine. "What do you smell?" Caleb murmured. The dog pawed once at the wood. Caleb frowned. The handle barely moved when he tested it. Rust ground loudly inside the mechanism. For a second, he thought the whole thing might break off in his hand. Then suddenly, the latch gave way. The door opened inward with a long groan that echoed through the empty alley. Dust shifted inside the darkness. Cold, stale air drifted outward, carrying an unexpected scent beneath the mildew and age. Beeswax. Faint. Old. But still there. Ghost entered first. Carefully. Caleb followed close behind, instincts automatically taking over. His eyes scanned corners, windows, ceiling beams, exits. The interior was larger than he expected. The room stretched deep into shadow beneath thick wooden rafters blackened by decades of smoke and heat. Long abandoned shelves lined the walls, cluttered with rusted tools, cracked glass jars, and collapsed cardboard boxes eaten away by moisture. Dust covered almost everything. Almost. Caleb noticed immediately. Certain patches on the limestone floor looked disturbed. Not recently, but not untouched either. The center of the room was dominated by a massive cast iron wax vat, resting atop a thick, circular stone foundation. The iron surface was dark with age, heavy enough that it looked permanently fused to the earth itself. Ghost walked directly toward it. No hesitation. No distraction. His claws clicked sharply against the stone floor as he circled the vat once, nose lowered, breathing slowly. Then he stopped. The dog stared downward. Caleb stepped closer. "What is it, boy?" Ghost whined again. The sound unsettled him more than barking would have, because Ghost almost never whined. Caleb crouched beside the vat, running his fingers along the stone foundation beneath it. The limestone felt colder than the surrounding floor. Smoother, somehow. Intentional. A strange pressure settled quietly into Caleb's chest. Not fear, exactly. Recognition. The same instinct that had once kept him alive overseas whispered softly at the edge of his thoughts. Something's wrong here. Outside, wind rattled the alley. The silence inside the shop deepened. Ghost suddenly turned his head sharply toward the back wall. Caleb followed his gaze immediately. Nothing moved. Only shadows stretching between old shelves and hanging iron hooks. Still, for one brief second, Caleb could have sworn he heard something. A scrape. Faint, almost buried beneath the sound of the wind. His body reacted instantly, shoulders tightening, breathing slowing, pulse sharpening. Ghost stood rigid beside the vat. The sound didn't come again. Caleb exhaled slowly through his nose. "You're losing it," he muttered quietly. Maybe he was. Lately, the line between memory and reality had started blurring around the edges. Sleep deprivation. PTSD. Too many years teaching his mind to expect danger everywhere. He stood again and walked farther into the shop. An old wooden staircase climbed toward a second-floor loft partially hidden in darkness. Several steps had collapsed completely. Cobwebs stretched between the railings. Near the back corner sat a workbench cluttered with rusted candle molds and hardened wax sealed inside cracked tin containers. Caleb picked one up. The wax still carried a faint honey scent beneath the dust. Strange. Nothing about this place made sense. A building this old should have been stripped clean years ago. Instead, it looked abandoned in a hurry, like somebody meant to come back. Ghost barked once suddenly. Sharp. Immediate. Caleb turned fast. The dog stood beside the vat again, staring directly at the stone floor beneath it. Then Ghost lowered himself slowly onto his stomach beside the base, guarding it. The sight sent a chill crawling up Caleb's spine. "Ghost." The dog didn't move. "Come on." Nothing. Ghost kept his eyes fixed downward as if listening to something beneath the stone itself. Caleb rubbed tiredly at his jaw. This town's already getting weird. The sky outside darkened quickly as afternoon clouds rolled deeper into the mountains. Rain tapped softly against the dirty windows. Caleb eventually returned to the truck and grabbed his duffel bag along with Ghost's old military blanket. If nothing else, the shop had walls and a roof. That was more than he had yesterday. By evening, the temperature dropped sharply. Caleb built a small fire inside an old iron stove near the back wall, using broken scraps of wood stacked beside the shop. Orange light flickered softly across the limestone interior, breathing life into shadows that had likely sat untouched for decades. Ghost still refused to leave the vat completely. Even while lying down, the dog kept himself positioned facing it. Watching. Caleb sat nearby on an overturned wooden crate, eating cold canned beans straight from the tin, while rain hammered steadily against the roof overhead. The fire crackled quietly. Outside, Briar Glen disappeared beneath fog and darkness. For the first time in weeks, Caleb felt something close to stillness settle over him. No shouting, no highway noise, no family arguments. Just rain, firelight, and Ghost breathing steadily nearby. He leaned back against the stone wall and closed his eyes briefly. The exhaustion hit him hard. Not physical exhaustion, soul exhaustion. The kind carried by men who spent too many years waiting for danger to arrive. At some point during the night, Caleb drifted into uneasy sleep. Then came the dream. Smoke. Radio static. Screaming over comms. The helicopter spinning sideways through black sky. Somebody yelling his name. Then fire. Always fire. Caleb jerked awake violently, reaching instinctively toward his waist for a weapon that no longer existed. His chest heaved. Sweat dampened his shirt despite the cold. The fire inside the stove had nearly burned out. The shop sat in darkness. For one disoriented moment, he didn't know where he was. Then Ghost growled, low, deep. Caleb froze instantly. The German shepherd stood near the vat again, ears forward, eyes locked on the floor beneath it. Another sound came. Soft. Faint. Scraping. This time Caleb heard it clearly. Not from outside. Not from the walls. From beneath the stone. Every muscle in his body tightened. Ghost stepped backward once but continued growling. Caleb slowly stood. The silence afterward felt enormous. Then, scrape. Closer this time, like something dragging lightly across concrete deep underground. Caleb grabbed the iron fireplace poker beside the stove and moved carefully toward the vat. His pulse pounded hard now. Ghost positioned himself beside Caleb's leg, ready. The scraping stopped completely. Caleb stared down at the circular stone base beneath the iron vat. The fire behind them flickered weakly. Shadows moved across the room. Nothing else. No sound. No movement. Yet the feeling remained. Someone or something was down there. And somehow, Ghost had known before he did. Morning arrived pale and gray over Briar Glen. Caleb stepped outside the candle shop with aching eyes and barely any sleep behind him. Fog rolled slowly between the mountains surrounding town, swallowing rooftops and telephone poles alike. Ghost remained close at his side as they walked toward Main Street searching for coffee and answers. The town was beginning to wake. An old pickup rattled past. A church bell echoed faintly somewhere uphill. Locals glanced curiously at Caleb as he passed, most noticing the dog before the man. The diner smelled like bacon grease and burnt coffee. Warm, safe, ordinary. Caleb sat in the corner booth near the window while Ghost settled heavily beside him. A waitress in her 60s refilled his coffee twice before finally asking, "You staying up at the old Holloway building?" Caleb looked up slowly. "You know it?" The woman paused. Everybody in the diner suddenly seemed quieter. "That place should have been torn down years ago," she muttered. Before Caleb could ask another question, the front door opened and an older man in a brown sheriff's jacket stepped inside carrying morning newspapers beneath one arm. He noticed Caleb immediately, and then he noticed Ghost. The sheriff walked over slowly. "You the fella sleeping in that candle shop?" Caleb nodded once. The sheriff studied him carefully. Then his eyes shifted toward Ghost. "That dog been acting strange?" Caleb's expression hardened slightly. "What do you mean, strange?" The sheriff hesitated. Outside, fog drifted slowly across the empty streets of Briar Glen. Then quietly, almost reluctantly, the sheriff said, "That building's been empty since Evelyn Holloway disappeared 42 years ago." Ghost lifted his head instantly, and somewhere deep beneath the candle shop, something scraped against stone again. The sound stayed with Caleb Mercer long after he left the diner that morning. Not loud, not dramatic, just enough to settle beneath his skin like a splinter his mind couldn't stop touching. The mountain air outside had turned colder. Fog drifted low across Briar Glen's streets while church bells echoed faintly through town. Ghost walked close beside Caleb, the German shepherd's ears constantly twitching toward distant sounds only he seemed able to hear. The sheriff's words replayed quietly in Caleb's head. Evelyn Holloway disappeared 42 years ago. People didn't vanish in towns this small without leaving scars behind. Caleb stopped near the railroad crossing and looked back toward the alley where the candle shop waited between rows of aging brick buildings. From a distance, it looked harmless, forgotten, dead, but his instincts refused to settle. Ghost suddenly pulled ahead slightly on the leash, toward the shop. "Yeah," Caleb muttered under his breath. "I know." By noon, rain clouds had swallowed most of the mountains surrounding Briar Glen. The town darkened beneath a heavy gray sky while wind rattled the dead vines climbing the candle shop walls. Inside, the building felt colder than before. The stale sweetness of old beeswax lingered faintly beneath the scent of dust and damp limestone. Ghost immediately moved toward the cast iron vat again. Straight to it. No hesitation. The dog circled the base once before stopping at the exact same spot as the night before. Then he sat, watching the floor. Caleb closed the front door behind them and stood silently for a moment, listening. Nothing. Only wind outside. Yet every instinct in his body remained alert. He slowly approached the vat again. Up close, the stone foundation beneath it bothered him more than before. The circular slab looked smoother than the surrounding floor, almost polished from years of contact. Thin mortar lines surrounded its edges with a precision that didn't match the rough-cut limestone elsewhere in the building. Caleb crouched lower. His fingers traced the seam carefully. There. A narrow gap. Too clean to be natural. Ghost whined softly. Caleb's pulse slowed the way it always had before dangerous missions overseas. Calm replacing panic. Focus replacing noise. He scanned the room carefully. Old tools hung from rusted hooks along the back wall. Most were useless now, eaten by time and corrosion. But near the collapsed workbench, he spotted a long iron pry bar partially buried beneath debris. Caleb picked it up. Heavy, still solid. Ghost stood immediately. "You already know what's down there, don't you?" Caleb murmured. The German shepherd stared at the slab without blinking. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere deep in the mountains. Caleb wedged the pry bar carefully against the edge of the stone seam and applied pressure. Nothing. The slab didn't move. He adjusted his angle and pushed harder. A faint grinding sound answered from beneath the floor. Ghost backed up one step. The slab shifted. Barely. But enough. Caleb stopped immediately. He listened. The silence afterward felt enormous. Then, scrape. Directly below him, closer than before. Ghost growled low in his throat. Caleb's grip tightened instinctively around the pry bar. The sound came again, slow, dragging, like something moving carefully underground. His heartbeat thudded heavily in his chest now. Every rational thought told him to walk away. Instead, he pushed harder. The pry bar groaned under pressure. Dust spilled from the seam. Then suddenly, crack! The limestone slab lifted nearly half an inch before settling again. Cold air rushed upward from below, carrying a strange mixture of earth, smoke, and old wax. Ghost barked sharply. Caleb stepped backward immediately, breathing hard. There was definitely space beneath the floor. A hidden chamber. He stared down at the slab in disbelief. Who builds a secret room beneath a candle shop? And why hide it under 80 years of iron and stone? The storm outside intensified. Rain hammered against the windows hard enough to shake the glass. Caleb stood motionless for several seconds. Then his military training quietly took over. Secure the area. Observe. Prepare. He moved through the shop gathering anything useful. An old lantern, extra firewood, a rusted hammer, coils of brittle rope. Ghost followed him everywhere now, staying unusually close. Once the room was prepared, Caleb returned to the slab. This time he positioned the pry bar deeper into the seam. Muscles tightened beneath his flannel shirt, as he forced the iron downward again. The stone groaned, shifted, lifted. Slowly, the slab began sliding aside inch by inch, revealing darkness beneath. Cold air poured upward stronger now. Ghost stood rigid beside him. Caleb finally shoved the slab far enough aside to expose a narrow square opening in the floor. Stone stairs descended into blackness below. Caleb froze. The chamber beneath wasn't rough or unfinished. It had been built carefully, intentionally. The stairs were carved limestone reinforced by wooden supports blackened with age. Faint shelves lined the walls below, disappearing into shadow. Ghost moved closer to the opening, then stopped. The dog sniffed downward once before letting out another low growl. Caleb lit the old lantern carefully. Warm yellow light flickered across the shop walls before he lifted it over the opening. The chamber below slowly emerged from darkness. Shelves, tables, glass jars, metal molds, candles, rows and rows of candles, an underground workshop, untouched by time. "Jesus," Caleb whispered. The room looked preserved, not abandoned. Dust covered some surfaces, but much less than upstairs. Thick wooden tables stood neatly arranged beside old equipment. Bundles of dried herbs hung from ceiling beams. Glass jars filled with hardened golden beeswax lined shelves along the walls. And near the center of the underground room, a military duffel bag. Old, faded green canvas. Caleb's stomach tightened. Ghost suddenly descended the first 3 stairs before stopping again. "Ghost." The dog glanced back briefly, then continued downward. Caleb followed carefully behind, lantern raised. The underground chamber swallowed sound completely. The storm above faded into distant, muffled vibrations, while warm lantern light danced across ancient stone walls. The air smelled stronger down here. Beeswax, smoke, cedar, and something else, something human. Caleb stepped carefully onto the chamber floor. His boots stirred faint dust across the limestone. Ghost moved silently between the tables, sniffing everything with intense focus. The deeper Caleb looked, the stranger the room became. Handwritten journals stacked neatly beside candle molds. Tin cups. Blankets folded carefully on shelves. Medical supplies. Military dog tags. Lots of them. Some hung from hooks beside old photographs pinned carefully against a wooden beam. Young men in military uniforms, most smiling, some with dogs beside them. Vietnam era. Caleb picked up one set of dog tags carefully. The metal felt cold against his fingertips. Private Daniel Reeves, U.S. Army. Ghost suddenly stopped near the far wall. His body stiffened again. Caleb followed immediately. At first, he didn't understand what the dog was staring at. Then he saw it. A single candle sitting alone on a small wooden table. Unlike the others, this one looked untouched by dust. Fresh. Caleb stepped closer slowly. The candle flame was gone, but the wax near the wick still glistened slightly. Warm. His blood turned cold. Someone had been here recently. Very recently. Ghost growled softly. Caleb spun toward the darkness beyond the shelves. The lantern light trembled slightly in his hand. The underground chamber suddenly felt much smaller. Not abandoned. Occupied. Then from somewhere deeper inside the tunnel beyond the far wall, a footstep echoed softly through the darkness. Ghost barked violently, and the lantern flame flickered hard as if something had just moved through the air nearby. Caleb spun toward the darkness beyond the underground shelves, every muscle in his body tightening instantly. The old military reflexes came back before thought could catch up. Breathing slowed. Vision narrowed. Adrenaline sharpened the edges of everything. Ghost stood in front of him now, protecting him. The German shepherd's growl rolled through the underground chamber low and steady, his eyes fixed on the narrow tunnel disappearing into darkness beyond the candle room. Another sound echoed faintly. Not footsteps this time. Metal. A soft clink somewhere deeper underground. Then silence. Complete silence. Caleb raised the lantern higher. The tunnel beyond the chamber was narrow, reinforced with old timber beams darkened by age and moisture. Thick shadows swallowed everything beyond 20 feet. "Who's there?" Caleb called out. His voice echoed strangely beneath the stone ceiling. No answer came. Only the distant dripping of water. Ghost moved forward 2 cautious steps, then stopped. The dog's ears twitched sharply. Whatever had been there was gone now, or hiding. Caleb stood perfectly still for nearly 30 seconds, listening harder than he had listened to anything in years. Nothing moved. Finally, Ghost's growl softened slightly. Not relaxed, but uncertain. Caleb exhaled slowly through his nose. "We're not chasing shadows today," he muttered quietly. The truth was simple. He had no weapon, no flashlight except the weak lantern. No idea how deep the tunnels ran beneath Briar Glen. And after years of war, Caleb Mercer had learned one lesson better than most men. Unknown spaces killed careless people. He slowly backed away from the tunnel entrance. Ghost reluctantly followed, though the dog glanced repeatedly toward the darkness as if he hated leaving it behind. Caleb forced himself to focus on the chamber instead. The room itself was unbelievable enough already. The underground workshop stretched wider than he first realized. Wooden shelves lined every wall, holding carefully preserved supplies that should have rotted decades ago. Thick jars of hardened beeswax gleamed gold beneath the lantern light. Bundles of dried lavender and cedar hung from ceiling hooks. Hand-carved molds sat arranged neatly across long wooden tables. Everything had been organized with care, with purpose, like somebody believed this place would matter again someday. Caleb stepped carefully toward the journals stacked near the center workbench. Most were leather-bound, cracked with age but still intact. He opened one slowly. Inside were pages of handwritten notes in elegant cursive. Wax temperatures, herb mixtures, burn times. Small observations about candle smoke and winter air. The entries shifted over time from simple craft notes into something more personal. December 14th, 1972. 3 more boys arrived tonight from Knoxville, one still shaking badly, barely 20 years old. Caleb frowned. He turned another page. January 3rd, 1973. The tunnels held through the storm. Thank God. The railroad men still ask questions, but Travis Boone's father continues pretending not to notice the missing supplies. Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly. Boone. The same last name the sheriff mentioned earlier. Ghost suddenly nudged Caleb's arm. The dog was staring toward the stairs leading back upstairs, listening. Then came the sound. A door closing somewhere above them. Caleb froze. Ghost growled instantly. Someone was inside the shop. The old SEAL moved immediately, lowering the lantern flame and guiding Ghost silently toward the stairwell. Years of training returned with terrifying ease. His boots barely made noise against the stone steps as he climbed. Halfway up, he stopped. Voices, muffled. 2 men. "You sure somebody's staying here?" Sheriff said the lights were on last night. Caleb's jaw tightened. Ghost's body coiled beside him. The voices moved across the floor above them. Heavy boots, slow, searching. Caleb extinguished the lantern completely. Darkness swallowed them. For several tense seconds, neither man nor dog moved. Then one of the voices spoke again. "Place gives me the creeps. You want to explain that to Boone?" Silence followed. Then the sound of boots retreating toward the front door. A moment later, the building creaked softly as the door opened and shut again. Ghost remained tense long afterward. Caleb waited another full minute before relighting the lantern. Boone. Again. The same name connected to the journal, connected to the men upstairs, connected to the hidden chamber. Whatever happened in Briar Glen decades ago clearly wasn't buried as deeply as people wanted. By late afternoon, the storm above had weakened into a cold mountain drizzle. Caleb carefully resealed the limestone slab beneath the wax vat before leaving the underground chamber hidden once more. No one needed to know what he'd found. Not yet. Ghost remained unusually alert as they walked through town toward the public library the sheriff had pointed out earlier. The Briar Glen Library sat near the edge of Main Street, inside an old brick building with ivy climbing its walls. Warm yellow light glowed through tall windows, while rain tapped softly against the glass. Inside smelled like old paper and cedar wood. Quiet. Safe. An older woman stood behind the circulation desk arranging returned books into careful stacks. She looked up as Caleb entered, and immediately noticed Ghost. Most people saw a dog first. She saw the scars, not the physical ones, the invisible kind. Her silver hair was tied neatly behind her head, and thin reading glasses rested low on her nose. She studied Caleb calmly for several seconds before speaking. "You're the veteran staying in the Holloway shop." Not a question. Caleb nodded once. "That obvious?" The woman gave a faint smile. "Only to people who've spent their lives watching others carry pain." Ghost walked toward her cautiously. She extended one hand gently. The German shepherd sniffed her fingers once before relaxing slightly. "Well," she said softly, "if Ghost approves, I suppose I can too." Caleb blinked. "You know his name?" "He's wearing it on his collar." For the first time in days, Caleb almost smiled. Almost. "I'm Margaret Doyle," the woman said. "Retired history teacher, current librarian, full-time keeper of everybody else's secrets." Caleb glanced around the quiet library. "You know about the candle shop?" Margaret's expression changed subtly. The warmth faded around the edges. "Yes," she said quietly. "More than most people." Rain streaked the tall windows behind her, while thunder rolled softly beyond the mountains. Margaret motioned toward a small reading table near the fireplace. "Sit." Caleb hesitated briefly before sitting across from her. Ghost settled immediately beside his chair, though the dog remained alert. Margaret folded her hands together carefully. "Evelyn Holloway disappeared during the winter of 1981, she said. "At least that's the official story." Caleb watched her closely. "And unofficially?" Margaret studied him for a long moment. "You were military?" "Yes." "You know the difference between official stories and truth?" Caleb said nothing. The fire crackled softly nearby. Finally, Margaret continued. "Evelyn wasn't just a candle maker. During the Vietnam years, she helped veterans who came home broken, boys sleeping under bridges, men with nowhere else to go." Caleb felt something tighten quietly inside his chest. Margaret noticed. "She hid them," she said softly. "Fed them. Let them sleep beneath the shop when the town wanted to pretend they didn't exist." "The tunnels." Margaret nodded slowly. "You found them." It wasn't a question either. Caleb leaned back slightly. "You knew they were there?" "Some of us did." Outside, rain intensified briefly against the windows. Margaret's voice lowered. "Years ago, those tunnels connected all the way beneath the railroad district. During bad winters, Evelyn used them to shelter veterans from the cold." "What happened?" Margaret looked toward the fire for a long moment before answering. "One winter storm changed everything." Ghost suddenly lifted his head. The library door opened behind them. A tall man entered wearing an expensive dark overcoat despite the muddy weather outside. Mid-60s, broad shoulders, silver hair. Power clung to him quietly. His eyes landed immediately on Caleb, then Ghost, then Margaret. The warmth vanished from Margaret Doyle's face completely. "Speak of the devil," she murmured. The man approached slowly. "Margaret." "Travis?" Caleb recognized the name instantly. Travis Boone's cold gaze shifted toward him. "You're the man staying in the Holloway building." Again, not a question. Caleb stood slowly. "That a problem?" Boone smiled faintly, but nothing about it reached his eyes. "That building isn't safe," Boone said calmly. "I've been trying to purchase it for years." Ghost stood now too, watching Boone carefully. Boone noticed the dog's reaction immediately. "Military K9?" he asked. "Yes." Boone nodded once. "My advice?" he said quietly. "Some places are abandoned for good reasons." The library suddenly felt colder. Caleb held Boone's stare without blinking. "Funny," he said. "I was starting to think somebody just wanted it forgotten." For the first time, Boone's expression shifted slightly. Only slightly. Then he smiled again. Thin. Controlled. "Be careful digging around old graves, Mr. Mercer." And with that, Travis Boone turned and walked back into the rain. The library remained silent long after the door shut behind him. Ghost moved closer to Caleb's side. Margaret Doyle stared toward the window with visible unease. Then quietly, almost to herself, she whispered, "He knows you found something." Rain slid down the library windows in silver streaks, while the fire crackled softly behind Margaret Doyle's desk. Outside, Briar Glen disappeared beneath cold mountain fog, but inside, the silence between Caleb and Margaret felt heavier than the storm itself. Caleb leaned back slowly in the wooden chair. "How?" Margaret's eyes remained fixed on the closed library door where Travis Boone had disappeared moments earlier. "Because Travis Boone notices everything that happens in this town," she said quietly. "Especially when it concerns the Holloway building." Ghost rested beside Caleb's chair, though the German shepherd hadn't fully relaxed since Boone arrived. One ear still pointed toward the street outside as if expecting the man to return. Caleb folded his arms. "What exactly happened in that shop?" Margaret exhaled slowly. "The version people tell now is simple. Evelyn Holloway vanished during a snowstorm in 1981. Sheriff searched the mountains. Never found a body. End of story." "And the truth?" Margaret looked at him carefully. "The truth is messier." The old librarian stood and walked slowly toward a shelf near the back wall. She pulled down a thick local history book and placed it gently on the table between them. Inside were black and white photographs of Briar Glen from decades earlier. Railroad workers, miners, church gatherings. Then one photograph stopped Caleb cold. Young soldiers, Vietnam veterans standing outside the candle shop. Several looked barely old enough to shave. One man sat on the front steps with a German shepherd beside him. Ghost noticed Caleb staring. The dog lifted his head slightly. "Evelyn took them in," Margaret said softly. "Back then, people didn't know what to do with soldiers who came home damaged, especially in towns like this." Caleb's jaw tightened. He knew that feeling too well. People loved soldiers in uniforms. They just struggled once the war came home inside them. Margaret turned another page. "Some men stayed in the tunnels beneath the railroad district for weeks during winter storms. Evelyn fed them. Let them work in the shop. Candle making helped calm them." Caleb frowned slightly. "Calm them?" Margaret nodded. "The repetition, the rhythm, heating wax, dipping wicks, it gave restless minds something steady to focus on." For a moment, Caleb said nothing, because he understood that better than he wanted to admit. War rewired people. Sometimes silence became unbearable. Sometimes hands needed work just to keep thoughts from drowning everything else. Margaret studied him carefully. "You haven't slept much since you arrived here." It wasn't a question. Caleb looked away toward the rain-covered windows. "No." "Nightmares?" His silence answered for him. Margaret's expression softened slightly. "My husband came back from Vietnam in 1971, she said quietly. Didn't talk for almost a year afterward. Some nights he'd sit outside in the snow until sunrise because he couldn't stand walls around him. Caleb finally looked back at her. "What helped him?" A sad smile touched her face. "Time, patience, purpose," she paused. "And a dog." Ghost shifted beside Caleb's boots as if he understood every word. By the time Caleb and Ghost left the library, darkness had settled fully over Briar Glen. The storm had weakened, but cold mist still drifted through the narrow streets. Old railroad tracks gleamed wet beneath the streetlights, while distant mountains vanished behind rolling clouds. The candle shop waited at the end of the alley exactly as they left it. Silent. Watching. Ghost entered first again, straight to the wax vat. Caleb closed the door behind them and stood quietly inside the dim room. The underground chamber remained hidden beneath the limestone slab, but he could feel its presence now every time he stepped near the center floor, like the building itself had a heartbeat buried underground. He lit the iron stove again and fed it fresh wood until warmth slowly spread through the shop. Orange light flickered across the limestone walls while rainwater dripped steadily outside. Ghost finally relaxed enough to lie beside the vat, though his eyes remained open. Caleb removed his flannel jacket and stared around the room. For the first time since arriving, he noticed something besides mystery. Potential. The old work tables, the molds, the shelves. Everything upstairs had once mattered to someone. He walked slowly toward the workbench cluttered with rusted candle tools. Several journals sat stacked near the edge beneath years of dust. Caleb opened one carefully. Inside were handwritten instructions in Evelyn Holloway's neat cursive. Temperature matters less than patience. Don't force the wax. Let each layer settle before adding another. He turned another page. Men heal slowly, too. Caleb stared at the words for a long moment. Then Ghost stood suddenly and walked over beside him. The dog nudged Caleb's hand once. Caleb let out a tired breath through his nose. "You think I should try this?" Ghost sat beside him silently. Caleb almost laughed. "Yeah," he murmured. "Guess we're both out of better options." The next morning arrived cold and clear. Sunlight finally broke through the storm clouds, casting pale gold across the mountains surrounding Briar Glen. Frost clung to rooftops while smoke curled lazily from chimneys throughout town. Inside the candle shop, Caleb stood staring at an old rusted melting pot balanced above the stove. He had no idea what he was doing. Ghost watched nearby from the floor. "You could at least pretend to help," Caleb muttered. The German shepherd blinked once. Caleb shook his head and returned to the journals. The instructions were simple enough in theory. Melt wax slowly. Keep the temperature steady. Dip the wick carefully. Repeat. In practice, it was another story entirely. His first attempt burned too hot. The second cooled unevenly. The third cracked completely down the middle. By noon, 3 ruined candles sat crookedly across the workbench like evidence of failure. Caleb rubbed both hands over his face in frustration. "This is ridiculous." Ghost stood and approached the table slowly. The dog sniffed the broken candles one by one before nudging the worst one gently onto the floor. It rolled near Caleb's boot. Caleb stared at it. Then unexpectedly, He laughed. A real laugh this time. Short, rusty, but real. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That one deserved it." The sound surprised him more than anything else, because he honestly couldn't remember the last time he laughed without forcing it. Ghost's tail thumped softly once against the floorboards. Outside, wind moved gently through the alley. The shop no longer felt abandoned. Throughout the afternoon, Caleb kept working, again and again and again. The rhythm slowly began settling into his body. Heat the wax. Wait. Dip the wick. Lift. Turn. Repeat. For the first time in years, his mind focused entirely on one simple task, instead of memories clawing endlessly at him from the dark. No gunfire. No helicopters. No screaming over radios. Just the slow movement of his hands and the scent of warm beeswax filling the room. At some point, Ghost fell asleep near the stove, peacefully, trusting the quiet. By evening, Caleb finally managed one candle that held its shape properly. Not perfect, slightly uneven near the base, but solid. He turned it carefully in his hands beneath the warm light. Something strange settled quietly inside his chest. Pride. Tiny. Fragile, but there. Ghost opened one eye as Caleb placed the candle carefully on the shelf. "Well," Caleb murmured, "nobody's buying it anytime soon." Ghost stood and walked beside him anyway. Caleb scratched slowly behind the dog's ears. Outside, Briar Glen glowed softly beneath the fading mountain sunset. The railroad tracks reflected streaks of orange light, while smoke drifted lazily above rooftops. Inside the candle shop, the air smelled warm for the first time in decades. Caleb sat on the floor beside Ghost as darkness slowly filled the windows. The silence no longer felt empty, and deep beneath the building, hidden below layers of limestone and shadow, the underground chamber waited quietly. Watching. Remembering. While upstairs, for the first time in years, Caleb Mercer created something instead of destroying it. And somehow, that frightened him almost as much as the tunnels. The candle sat alone on the workbench, while evening settled over Briar Glen in soft layers of blue-gray shadow. Outside, snow had begun falling quietly across the mountains, covering the old railroad tracks and empty streets beneath a blanket of white. Inside the shop, the small flame Caleb Mercer lit beside the finished candle flickered gently against the limestone walls. Warm, steady, alive. Ghost slept near the iron stove, though one ear still twitched occasionally toward the floor beneath the wax vat. Caleb leaned back in the old wooden chair and stared at the candle he'd made. It wasn't much, crooked near the base, uneven around the wick. But it existed. Something built by his hands instead of destroyed by them. That thought unsettled him deeply. For years, his hands had only known violence, survival, and loss. Even after leaving the SEAL teams, the war had followed him home inside his own nervous system. Every loud sound still hit like danger. Every nightmare still smelled like burning metal and blood. Some nights he woke reaching for teammates who no longer existed. And now somehow, a candle scared him. Because creating something meant there was still a part of him capable of caring whether tomorrow came or not. Ghost suddenly lifted his head. The German shepherd stared toward the front windows. Caleb noticed immediately. The dog stood slowly, alert, listening. Then came the sound. Crunch. Snow beneath boots outside. Caleb froze. Ghost moved silently toward the front door, growling low in his throat. Another crunch. Slow footsteps. Someone circling the building. Caleb quietly extinguished the candle flame and stood from the chair. His body shifted automatically into old habits. Calm breathing, controlled movement, listening harder than thinking. The footsteps moved toward the alley beside the shop, then stopped. Ghost's growl deepened. Caleb carefully approached the dusty front window and peered through a narrow gap in the grime. At first he saw nothing but falling snow, then movement. A man in a dark jacket stood near the alley entrance, partially hidden beneath the streetlight. Tall, broad shoulders, cigarette ember glowing briefly red in the darkness. Watching the shop, Caleb's pulse slowed dangerously. The man looked toward the building one last time, then disappeared into the snow. Ghost barked sharply. "Quiet," Caleb whispered. The dog immediately obeyed but remained tense. Caleb stayed at the window long after the figure vanished. Somebody was definitely watching him now, and deep down, he already knew why. The next morning arrived buried beneath fresh snow. Briar Glen looked softer somehow under winter light, almost peaceful despite the cold. Smoke drifted from chimneys, while tire tracks cut carefully through frozen streets. Inside the candle shop, Caleb woke stiff and exhausted. The nightmares returned hard during the night. Snowstorms always made them worse. Whiteout conditions overseas, frozen mountain villages, bodies beneath collapsed concrete. Too much memory tied to winter. Ghost sat beside him quietly, while Caleb rubbed both hands over his face, trying to steady his breathing. The dog nudged him gently once, grounding him. "You keep saving my life," Caleb muttered hoarsely. Ghost simply stared back. Outside, church bells echoed faintly through town. Caleb spent most of the day working, cleaning shelves, repairing broken tools, melting more wax. The process calmed him again in ways he didn't fully understand. The repetitive rhythm slowed the constant noise inside his head. Heat the wax. Wait. Dip the wick. Repeat. For several hours, the shop almost felt normal. Then Ghost started growling. Low. Immediate. Caleb looked up from the workbench. The dog stood rigid near the back hallway, leading toward the storage room. Snow blew softly against the rear windows. Ghost barked once, sharp. "What is it?" The German shepherd moved toward the back door. Caleb followed quickly. The moment he opened the door, icy wind rushed into the shop, carrying sharp flakes of snow across the floorboards. Boot prints, fresh, leading away from the building, straight toward the alley behind the railroad district. Caleb's stomach tightened. Ghost lunged forward immediately. "Ghost!" Too late. The dog was already tracking the scent through the snow. Caleb grabbed his jacket and followed fast into the freezing afternoon. The alley twisted behind abandoned warehouses and rusted train cars, half buried beneath snowdrifts. Wind howled through broken windows, while snow whipped between the buildings hard enough to sting exposed skin. Ghost moved with frightening focus, nose low, body tense, tracking. The footprints led toward a collapsed maintenance shed near the edge of the railroad yard, then disappeared. Ghost stopped suddenly, growling. Caleb slowed carefully. Something felt wrong, too quiet. Then, movement exploded from the darkness beside him. A man slammed into Caleb hard enough to drive him sideways into the frozen brick wall. Years of combat reflexes saved him instantly. Caleb twisted, throwing his attacker partly off balance as both men crashed violently into the snow. The attacker wore a dark ski mask and heavy winter coat. Strong, fast, prepared. A fist slammed into Caleb's ribs before he managed to drive his elbow into the man's side. The attacker staggered backward. Ghost hit him a second later. The German shepherd launched through the snow like a missile, knocking the masked man flat onto the frozen ground. The attacker screamed and swung wildly, producing a knife from beneath his coat. Caleb's blood turned cold. "Ghost!" The blade flashed once. Ghost yelped sharply, then kept attacking. The dog clamped onto the man's arm with terrifying force, dragging him sideways through the snow while the knife disappeared beneath them. Caleb tackled the attacker hard before he could recover. The two men slammed against the frozen railroad tracks, struggling violently in the snowstorm. Caleb drove his forearm across the man's throat while trying to rip away the mask. But suddenly the attacker shoved free hard enough to break loose, then ran, fast, disappearing between abandoned rail cars into the blizzard before Caleb could catch him. "Damn it!" Caleb turned instantly toward Ghost. The German shepherd stood several feet away, trembling slightly, blood dripping onto the snow beneath his front shoulder. Fear punched through Caleb harder than the fight itself. "Ghost!" The dog tried stepping forward but stumbled once. Caleb dropped beside him immediately. The knife wound wasn't massive, but deep enough. Blood stained the dog's fur dark against the white snow. Ghost pressed weakly against Caleb anyway, still trying to protect him. "You stubborn idiot," Caleb whispered shakily. The dog's breathing remained steady, but pain burned clearly in his eyes now. Caleb removed his jacket instantly and pressed it carefully against the wound. His hands shook, not from cold, from memory. Suddenly, he wasn't in North Carolina anymore. He was back overseas, back kneeling beside wounded men in freezing dirt while helicopters failed to arrive on time, back hearing people bleed out while promising help was coming. The panic rose fast inside his chest, too fast. "Ooh," Ghost whined softly. The sound snapped Caleb back instantly. Focus. Breathe. Move. He lifted the German shepherd carefully into his arms, despite the dog's size and weight. "You're okay," Caleb said firmly, though his own voice barely sounded steady. "Stay with me." Snow hammered against them while Caleb carried Ghost back through the railroad yard. Every step hurt, not physically, emotionally, because the thought of losing the dog terrified him more than he wanted to admit. By the time Caleb reached Main Street, blood soaked through the sleeve of his flannel shirt. Several townspeople stared as he rushed past, carrying the wounded K9 through falling snow. The small veterinary clinic near the church was still open. A bell rang overhead as Caleb shoved through the front door. A young veterinarian looked up from the counter, then immediately saw the blood. "Help him," Caleb said hoarsely. The woman moved instantly. Within seconds, Ghost disappeared through swinging doors toward the back treatment room. Caleb stood alone in the waiting area, breathing hard while melted snow dripped from his boots onto the tile floor. His hands still shook. Blood stained his fingers. Ghost's blood. And suddenly the fear hit him completely. Not the controlled fear of combat. Not tactical fear. Human fear. Because somewhere along the road, between Tennessee and Briar Glen, that dog had quietly become the only family he had left. Outside, snow continued falling across the mountains, and somewhere hidden beneath the candle shop, the tunnels waited silently beneath the frozen town, watching. Snow continued falling across Briar Glen long after midnight, covering the railroad yard and empty streets beneath layers of white. Wind rattled loose signs along Main Street while pale light glowed from the small veterinary clinic near the church. Inside, Caleb Mercer sat alone in the waiting room, with both elbows resting on his knees and dried blood still staining his hands. Ghost's blood. The smell of antiseptic and wet fur hung in the air. Every few minutes, Caleb looked toward the swinging doors leading to the treatment rooms. Every time they stayed closed, the pressure in his chest tightened further. He hated waiting, always had. In war, waiting usually meant someone was dying nearby. A clock ticked softly above the receptionist's desk. Outside, tires hissed through snow somewhere beyond the windows. Then finally, the doors opened. The young veterinarian stepped out, removing her gloves slowly. Caleb stood instantly. "How bad?" "She's lucky," the woman said gently. Caleb blinked once, then almost laughed from pure relief. "She?" The veterinarian smiled faintly. "Ghost's a female German shepherd." Caleb looked stunned for half a second. "You're kidding! You never checked?" Ghost had come to Caleb after a transfer overseas years earlier. Explosives detection, search operations, protection detail. By then, the dog already answered to Ghost and followed commands perfectly. Nobody ever corrected him. The veterinarian's expression softened further. "She'll recover." Knife missed the shoulder joint by maybe half an inch. Caleb exhaled slowly and leaned briefly against the wall. For a moment, his eyes closed. Not from exhaustion. Relief. The veterinarian studied him carefully. "She protected you?" Caleb nodded once. "Always does." A few minutes later, he entered the treatment room quietly. Ghost lay on a thick blanket beneath warm lights, bandages wrapped carefully around her shoulder. Her breathing remained steady despite the sedatives, though one ear twitched the moment Caleb approached. "Hey," he whispered. Ghost lifted her head weakly. The dog tried standing immediately. Caleb crouched beside her fast. "Nope, stay down." Her tail thumped once against the blanket. Caleb rested one hand gently against her neck. The fear inside him finally eased enough to breathe normally again. "You scared the hell out of me." Ghost stared back calmly, like she didn't understand why he was upset. Or maybe she understood perfectly. Outside the clinic window, snow drifted endlessly through the darkness. And somewhere beneath that frozen town, somebody still wanted the tunnels hidden badly enough to spill blood over them. The next morning arrived painfully bright after the storm. Sunlight reflected sharply off fresh snow covering Briar Glen's rooftops and railroad tracks. The mountains surrounding town looked untouched beneath layers of ice and fog. Ghost limped slightly when they returned to the candle shop later that afternoon, but otherwise she remained determined to stay close to Caleb. Too close. Every few steps, she checked his position, as if worried he might disappear. Caleb unlocked the shop door carefully. The moment they stepped inside, Ghost stopped. Her posture changed immediately. Alert again. The warmth and calm from previous days had vanished. Caleb felt it too. Something was wrong. He moved slowly through the shop, scanning the room. Nothing obvious had changed. Then he noticed the workbench. The journals. Someone had touched them. One book now sat open near the edge, exactly where Caleb hadn't left it. Ghost growled softly. Caleb crossed the room quickly. Inside the open journal, one sentence had been underlined heavily in dark pencil. "The tunnels must never be reopened." Caleb's stomach turned cold. He flipped through the remaining pages. Nothing else disturbed. No theft. Just the message. A warning. Ghost moved toward the back hallway leading underground. The dog's fur stood slightly along her spine despite the injury. Caleb followed carefully. The limestone slab beneath the wax vat remained sealed, but fresh moisture stained the edges. Recently moved. His pulse slowed dangerously. Somebody had entered the tunnels while he was gone. Caleb crouched slowly beside the slab. Ghost pressed close beside him. The old fear returned quietly beneath his ribs. Not fear of violence, fear of history. Because every answer they uncovered only led deeper into something uglier buried beneath Briar Glen. That evening, Margaret Doyle arrived carrying 2 grocery bags and an old oil lantern. "You look terrible," she said the moment Caleb opened the door. "Thanks. You're welcome." Ghost walked carefully toward her, tail wagging once despite the bandages. Margaret crouched immediately beside the dog. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered softly. "You brave girl." Ghost rested her head briefly against Margaret's hand. Caleb watched quietly from the stove. The sight stirred something strange inside him again. Normalcy. Human warmth. Things war had taught him not to expect anymore. Margaret eventually stood and placed the grocery bags on the workbench. "Soup? Bread? Coffee? You didn't have to do that. Yes, she said firmly. I did. Outside, twilight settled across the mountains while snow slid quietly from rooftops into the alley below. Margaret noticed the open journal immediately. Her expression darkened. He came here. Caleb nodded. You know that handwriting? Margaret stared at the underlined sentence for several seconds before answering. No. But you know who. A long silence passed. Finally, she sighed. Travis Boone's father controlled half this town in the 70s. Railroad contracts, mining rights, land ownership. People did what he told them to do. What happened in the tunnels? Margaret moved slowly toward the stove. The official story was always simple, she said quietly. A snowstorm caused flooding beneath the railroad district. Several homeless veterans disappeared. And unofficially? Margaret looked toward Ghost, lying beside the fire. Then back at Caleb. Some people believe the tunnels were sealed intentionally. The room fell silent. Wind rattled softly against the windows. Caleb stared at her. Why? Because one of the veterans hiding down there witnessed something. What? Margaret shook her head slowly. No one ever knew for certain. But after that winter, Boone's father paid workers to collapse sections of the tunnels permanently. Ghost lifted her head suddenly, listening. Caleb heard it too. A distant metallic sound. Faint. Underground. Margaret froze. The sound came again. Clang, like metal striking stone somewhere far below the shop. Ghost stood despite the pain in her shoulder. Easy, Caleb whispered. But the dog was already moving toward the wax vat. Her growl deepened. Margaret's face lost color. They're using the tunnels. Caleb grabbed the lantern immediately. Who? Margaret looked genuinely afraid now. I don't know anymore. The sound echoed again beneath the floor. Closer this time. Ghost barked sharply. Caleb moved toward the slab without hesitation. The limestone shifted heavily as he forced it open again. Cold air rushed upward, carrying damp earth and old smoke. Ghost descended first, despite her injury. Ghost! Too late. The German shepherd disappeared into the underground chamber below. Caleb followed fast with the lantern raised. The tunnel room looked untouched at first glance. Then he saw it. Fresh boot prints in the dust, leading deeper into the tunnels beyond the workshop. Ghost stood near the tunnel entrance, growling hard now. Margaret appeared cautiously behind Caleb holding the second lantern. The old woman stared into the darkness with visible fear. I haven't been down here since 1981, she whispered. Caleb studied the footprints. Heavy boots. One person, moving fast. He followed the trail deeper into the narrow tunnel, while Ghost stayed close beside him. The underground passage twisted beneath Briar Glen like buried veins. Old support beams groaned softly overhead, while water dripped steadily along the stone floor. Then the tunnel widened suddenly. Caleb stopped cold. An old underground rail platform emerged from darkness ahead. Rust-covered tracks disappeared into collapsed sections beyond the walls. Wooden crates sat rotting beside rusted lantern hooks, and painted faintly across the far wall in fading white letters. Safe shelter. Ghost sniffed near a pile of collapsed debris, then pawed hard at something beneath the dust. Caleb approached slowly. Military dog tags. Dozens of them, scattered across the floor. Margaret covered her mouth quietly. Oh, God. Caleb knelt carefully, lifting one set from the dust, then another, and another. Names, dates, units. Most from Vietnam. Some Army, some Marines, one Navy. The deeper truth hit him slowly. These weren't just tunnels. This had been a refuge, a hidden underground sanctuary beneath Briar Glen for soldiers nobody wanted to see. Ghost suddenly barked once toward the darkness beyond the rail platform. A flashlight beam flashed briefly in the tunnel ahead, then vanished instantly. Someone else was still down there, watching them. The flashlight beam vanished so quickly, Caleb almost questioned whether he'd actually seen it. But Ghost hadn't imagined it. The German Shepherd stood rigid near the underground rail platform, growling into the darkness beyond the collapsed tunnel. Margaret Doyle's breathing sounded shallow behind him. "Caleb," she whispered carefully, "we need to leave." But Caleb didn't move. The narrow beam of his lantern swept slowly across the old tunnel walls. Moisture glistened along ancient stone while rusted rail tracks disappeared into shadows thick enough to swallow light completely. The air down there felt wrong, heavy, like the tunnels remembered too much. Ghost took one cautious step forward, then another. "No," Caleb said quietly. The dog stopped immediately, but kept staring ahead. A faint sound echoed from deep underground. Not footsteps this time. Breathing. Someone trying very hard not to be heard. Caleb's pulse slowed dangerously. His body remembered moments like this too well. Afghanistan caves, collapsed compounds, dark spaces where men waited with guns and patience. Only now he stood beneath a mountain town carrying a lantern instead of a rifle. Margaret touched his arm carefully. "Please." Her voice shook. Caleb finally looked back at her. Fear had drained the color from her face completely. "How many people knew about this place?" he asked softly. Margaret swallowed hard. "Not many. Evelyn, a few railroad workers, some church people." She hesitated. "My husband." Caleb frowned slightly. "You never told me that." "He stayed down here once after Vietnam." Her eyes drifted through the darkness around them. "He said the tunnels were the only place he could sleep." The sadness in her voice settled heavily beneath the silence. Ghost suddenly barked once, sharp, immediate, then bolted forward into the darkness. "Ghost!" Too late. The German Shepherd disappeared beyond the lantern light entirely. Caleb cursed under his breath and ran after her. The tunnel narrowed sharply ahead, forcing him sideways between rough stone walls slick with moisture. His boots splashed through shallow water, while old support beams groaned somewhere overhead. "Ghost!" Only echoes answered. Then came barking, distant, angry. Caleb pushed harder through the tunnel. The beam of his lantern bounced wildly across old rail signs and collapsed crates scattered along the floor. Snowmelt dripped steadily through cracks above, carrying the smell of wet earth deep underground. Behind him, Margaret called his name once, then vanished from hearing distance completely. The tunnel suddenly split into two separate passages. Caleb stopped hard. Ghost's barking echoed from the left, then abruptly cut off. The silence afterward hit him like a punch to the chest. "Ghost!" Nothing. Panic rose instantly. Not tactical fear, personal fear. The kind he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Caleb turned left and forced himself deeper underground. The passage sloped downward sharply now, beneath Briar Glen. Ancient wiring hung loose from the ceiling, while abandoned lantern brackets lined the walls every 20 feet. Then the tunnel opened. A massive underground chamber emerged from darkness ahead. Caleb froze. It looked like an old railway storage depot buried beneath the mountain itself. Broken carts sat overturned near rusted tracks while stacks of collapsed crates formed jagged shadows across the room. And at the far end, a narrow beam of moonlight. Snow drifted slowly through a collapsed opening high above. An exit. Ghost's tracks crossed the muddy floor directly toward it. Caleb followed fast. His lantern swept across the chamber walls. then stopped. Photographs, hundreds of them, pinned carefully to wooden boards lining the stone. Veterans, young men in military uniforms, some smiling awkwardly beside dogs, others seated around candle-lit tables underground. One photo showed Evelyn Holloway standing among them, holding a tray of candles, while snow piled outside the tunnel entrance behind her. Caleb stepped closer slowly. The photographs ended abruptly near the back wall. The final image had been ripped nearly in half. Only one sentence remained visible beneath it. The storm came early. A sudden crash echoed somewhere ahead. Caleb spun instantly. Ghost! This time he heard her clearly, barking, desperate. He sprinted toward the moonlit opening at the far side of the chamber. The tunnel beyond climbed sharply upward beneath an old railway bridge buried in snow. Wind howled through broken stone while moonlight reflected across frozen rock walls. Then Caleb saw her. Ghost stood trapped beneath collapsed beams and shattered stone near the tunnel ceiling. One rear leg pinned beneath debris. Snow drifted through the broken opening above her while she barked furiously toward the wall behind her. Not at Caleb. At the wall. Easy, Caleb breathed. He dropped beside her immediately. Ghost whimpered softly but kept barking toward the stone behind her. Caleb grabbed the largest beam pinning her leg and pulled hard. It barely moved. The collapse had jammed everything together. Snow and ice shifted overhead with every movement. The entire tunnel felt unstable. Come on, Caleb grunted. Muscles strained hard beneath his coat as he lifted again. The beam shifted slightly. Ghost yelped in pain. Then suddenly, crack! Stone broke loose somewhere above them. Caleb froze. Snow poured through the ceiling opening. The tunnel was collapsing further. Damn it! Ghost barked sharply again toward the wall behind her. Caleb looked. At first he saw only cracked stone. Then something caught the lantern light. Metal. He brushed away dirt and frozen mud quickly. Dog tags, embedded in the wall itself. His blood turned cold. Caleb shoved harder at the beam. This time it lifted enough. Ghost dragged herself free immediately despite the injured leg and limped toward him. Then she returned to the wall, digging, frantic now. Ghost! The dog ignored him. Snow continued falling through the broken tunnel ceiling while deep cracks spread slowly across the stone overhead. Ghost barked again. Caleb finally knelt beside her. Behind the collapsed rocks, hidden beneath dirt and mortar, human bones slowly emerged from the wall itself. Caleb stopped breathing. The remains had been sealed inside intentionally. Military dog tags still hung around the skeleton's neck. Several more sets lay scattered nearby beneath the debris. Oh God, Ghost whined softly. Caleb stared in horror. This wasn't an accident. The veterans hadn't simply disappeared during a storm. Someone buried them down there. The tunnel groaned violently overhead. Stone cracked again. Caleb grabbed Ghost immediately. We're leaving, now! The German shepherd resisted briefly, still staring toward the remains. Then another section of ceiling collapsed nearby. That ended the argument. Caleb lifted Ghost into his arms and ran. The underground tunnel shook around them while snow and rock crashed behind him. Dust filled the air thick enough to choke, while old support beams splintered in the darkness. The entire mountain seemed to roar. Caleb pushed harder through the tunnel, carrying the dog against his chest. Ghost trembled violently now, but stayed silent. One thought pounded through Caleb's head louder than everything else. They sealed them inside. Not one man. Multiple. Buried alive beneath Briar Glen. The underground chamber finally appeared ahead through dust and darkness. Caleb stumbled into the rail depot seconds before a thunderous collapse shook the tunnel behind him, completely shut. The ground trembled beneath his boots. Then silence returned. Heavy. Absolute. Caleb lowered Ghost carefully onto the floor. The dog immediately pressed herself against him, breathing hard. Caleb sat there beside her beneath the ancient tunnel chamber, while dust drifted slowly through the lantern light. Neither moved for a long time. Finally, Ghost rested her head against his knee. Caleb stared toward the collapsed tunnel behind them. His chest tightened painfully, because now he understood something terrible. The town hadn't forgotten those veterans. Someone made sure they disappeared. And somewhere above them in Briar Glen, people were still protecting the truth. The underground rail chamber sat buried beneath layers of stone and silence while dust drifted slowly through the lantern light. Caleb Mercer remained seated beside Ghost on the cold concrete floor, his breathing finally beginning to steady after the tunnel collapse. Ghost leaned heavily against his side, alive. That was all Caleb cared about for several long minutes. Outside the broken tunnel entrance, wind howled faintly through the mountain above them. Snow filtered down through cracks in the ceiling, like pale ash drifting across forgotten graves. Caleb rested one hand carefully against Ghost's bandaged shoulder. "You keep trying to get yourself killed," he muttered quietly. Ghost lifted her head slightly, then rested it back against his knee. The dog's calmness steadied him again, the same way it always had. In Syria, Afghanistan. Now here beneath Briar Glen, Margaret Doyle finally emerged slowly from the tunnel behind them, carrying the second lantern. Her face looked pale beneath the shaking light. When she saw the collapsed passage behind Caleb, her eyes widened. "Oh, Lord!" Caleb nodded once. There were bodies in the wall. Margaret stopped breathing for a second. Then very slowly, she sat beside an overturned rail cart nearby. Ghost watched her carefully, but didn't growl. Margaret's voice came out barely above a whisper. "How many?" "I don't know." The old librarian closed her eyes briefly. Tears gathered there immediately. Caleb stared toward the collapsed tunnel again. "They sealed them in." The words sounded colder, spoken aloud, more real. Margaret lowered her face into trembling hands. "For 40 years, she whispered. 40 years people pretended they just disappeared. No one spoke after that. The silence beneath the mountain felt sacred somehow, heavy with memory. Eventually, Caleb stood again. "We're not done here." Margaret looked up sharply. "Caleb, there's more." He already knew it. The tunnels weren't random. The hidden chamber beneath the candle shop wasn't random. The photographs, the dog tags, the warnings. Someone had buried an entire history under Briar Glen and spent decades protecting it. Ghost rose carefully beside him despite exhaustion. The German shepherd limped badly now, but still stayed close. Together they moved deeper into the underground rail chamber. The farther they explored, the clearer the truth became. This place had once been alive. Old cots lined the walls beneath dusty blankets. Rusted coffee tins sat beside tiny stoves built into alcoves along the tunnel. Hand-painted signs marked sections of the underground platform. Medical storage sleeping area near one corner, Caleb found shelves stacked with canned food preserved in ancient dust. And candles. Hundreds of candles. Everywhere. Margaret stared around the chamber in disbelief. "I forgot how large it was." "You've been here before?" She nodded slowly. "Only once. My husband brought me down after he returned from Vietnam." Her eyes drifted through the darkness. "He said Evelyn wanted the men to have someplace warm where nobody judged them." Caleb swallowed hard. The deeper he walked through the chamber, the more personal everything became. This wasn't a bunker. It wasn't a hideout. It was a sanctuary. Built quietly beneath a town that preferred not to see broken soldiers above ground. Ghost suddenly stopped near the far wall. The dog sniffed at a stack of collapsed crates buried beneath dust and old blankets, then pawed once. Caleb approached carefully. The crates had fallen against a narrow wooden door hidden behind shelving. A hidden room. Margaret's face tightened immediately. I never saw that before. Caleb pulled the door open slowly. The hinges groaned softly. Inside sat a tiny office no larger than a closet. A desk, a chair, shelves of journals, and one small wooden box sealed carefully with faded blue ribbon. The air smelled faintly of old paper and beeswax. Ghost entered first. The dog walked directly to the desk and sat, waiting. Caleb approached slowly. On the desk rested a single leather journal untouched by dust, different from the others, more personal. Carefully, he opened it. The first page read, "If someone finds this after I am gone, please tell their families the truth. Signed, Evelyn Holloway." Margaret covered her mouth softly. Caleb turned pages carefully. The entries grew darker over time. December 22nd, 1981. The storm arrived too early. The lower tunnels are flooding near the rail crossing. December 24th, 1981. Travis Boone's father came tonight, demanding the men leave town before morning. Daniel refused. December 25th, 1981. I heard them arguing underground after midnight. Caleb's heartbeat slowed. Ghost remained perfectly still beside the desk. Then Caleb turned another page. The handwriting changed. Shakier now. December 26th, 1981. They sealed the north tunnel while men were still inside. Margaret let out a broken sound beside him. No, Caleb kept reading. I tried reaching them through the railway passage, but the collapse trapped us apart. God forgive this town for what it allowed. The next several pages were stained badly with water and age. Then Caleb found the final entry. If anyone survives this, tell their families they were not abandoned by each other. They were abandoned by fear. The words settled into the room like smoke. Caleb stared silently at the page, because he understood that sentence too well. War changed men, but fear changed communities. Fear made good people look away while terrible things happened nearby. Ghost suddenly nudged Caleb's hand again. The dog's nose pointed toward the small wooden box on the desk. Caleb opened it carefully. Inside were dozens of letters, each one sealed, each labeled with names and military units. Letters to families. Never mailed. Margaret sat slowly in the chair behind them, tears running freely now. She tried to tell them, she whispered. Caleb lifted one envelope carefully, then froze. The handwriting on the front punched the air from his lungs completely. To Thomas Mercer, his father. For several seconds, Caleb couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Ghost pressed closer, instantly sensing the change in him. Margaret looked up slowly. What is it? Caleb stared at the envelope. My father. The room went silent. Even the wind outside seemed to disappear. Hands shaking slightly, Caleb broke the seal carefully. Inside was a folded letter yellowed with age. He unfolded it slowly beneath the lantern light. Thomas, if you are reading this, then somehow you survived what happened beneath Briar Glen. I pray that means you escaped before the tunnel collapsed completely. The men never blamed you for leaving to find help. Please remember that. None of this was your fault. Caleb stopped reading. His pulse pounded hard now. Ghost rested her head against his leg again. Margaret stared at him in disbelief. Your father was here? Caleb nodded faintly. The words blurred briefly before his eyes. He forced himself to continue. You carried enough guilt long before this storm arrived. Don't carry ours too. Tell your son someday that surviving is not the same thing as failing others. The letter slipped slightly in Caleb's hand. "Tell your son someday." The realization hit slowly. His father never spoke about Briar Glen because he lived with this buried inside him his entire life. The drinking, the silence, the distance. Maybe it started here. Not after Caleb's wars, before them. Like pain passed quietly from father to son. Caleb lowered the letter slowly. For years he blamed himself for not being able to come home whole. But maybe brokenness had already been waiting for him long before he ever joined the military. Margaret's voice trembled softly. "Your father never came back here." Caleb shook his head. "Not once." Ghost suddenly stood again, alert. Her ears pointed sharply toward the outer tunnel. Caleb immediately folded the letter and extinguished the lantern flame. Darkness swallowed the hidden office. Then came the sound. Footsteps. Above them. Multiple. Moving across the underground rail chamber. Slow. Searching. Caleb's body tightened instantly. Ghost growled low beside him. Someone else had entered the tunnels again. And this time, they weren't alone. The footsteps echoed slowly through the underground rail chamber above the hidden office. Heavy boots against damp concrete. More than one man. Caleb Mercer remained perfectly still inside the darkness, while Ghost stood beside him, growling low in her throat. Margaret Doyle's breathing sounded shallow behind them. Flashlight beams suddenly swept across the outer chamber. White light moved between old rail carts and stacks of crates, cutting through darkness like searchlights. "They're down here somewhere," a voice muttered. Caleb recognized it instantly. The man from the railroad yard. The one who stabbed Ghost. His pulse slowed dangerously. Ghost pressed tighter against Caleb's leg, sensing the shift in him. Another flashlight beam passed directly across the hidden office doorway before moving on. "They couldn't have gotten far," another man said. A third voice answered quietly. Boone said no bodies, no witnesses. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Caleb's jaw tightened hard enough to ache. So Travis Boone really was willing to kill to keep the tunnels buried. The men spread through the chamber, slowly searching. One flashlight beam stopped near the collapsed tunnel entrance where Caleb and Ghost escaped earlier. "Looks unstable." "Then burn the whole damn place." The words hit like ice water. Caleb looked toward Margaret immediately. Her face had gone pale again. "They're going to destroy the tunnels," she whispered. Ghost growled harder. Caleb made his decision instantly. "Back exit?" Margaret pointed silently toward the rear wall of the hidden office. "There used to be a maintenance passage leading toward the river." Caleb grabbed the letters and Evelyn's journal quickly, stuffing them inside his jacket. No way was he leaving the evidence behind. Then one of the men shouted, "Over here!" A flashlight beam locked directly onto the hidden office doorway. "Move!" Caleb snapped. The first gunshot exploded through the tunnel chamber. Stone shattered near the office doorframe. Ghost barked violently. Caleb shoved Margaret toward the rear passage just as another shot echoed underground. Dust filled the air. The old tunnels roared with echoes. The maintenance passage behind the office was barely large enough to crawl through. Rusted pipes lined the walls while freezing water dripped steadily from overhead stone. Behind them, voices shouted through the chamber. "They went through there!" Ghost limped beside Caleb and Margaret despite the pain in her shoulder. Every few seconds she glanced backward, listening to the pursuit behind them. The tunnel narrowed sharply, then widened again into an old utility corridor running beneath the railroad district. Caleb recognized the smell immediately. Smoke. Not old smoke. Fresh. His stomach dropped. They started the fire already. Behind them, orange light suddenly flickered through the passage they'd escaped from. The men were burning the tunnels. Ghost barked sharply. "Hurry!" Margaret cried. The old woman stumbled once on the uneven ground. Caleb caught her arm instantly and kept moving. The smoke spread fast underground. Too fast. Years of combat training screamed the danger immediately. Confined space, limited exits, old support beams. The fire could collapse everything beneath Briar Glen. The tunnel ahead finally sloped upward. Cold air rushed downward toward them, carrying snow and river water. An exit. Caleb shoved open the rusted maintenance hatch above them. Night exploded around them. Snow, wind, the black river cutting through Briar Glen beneath the old railway bridge. They climbed out onto the frozen riverbank, gasping for air, while smoke poured upward from cracks in the ground behind them. Then Caleb saw it. Fire. Orange flames rising from the candle shop itself across the railroad district. "No!" Ghost barked wildly. The fire spread quickly through the old wooden roof beneath the falling snow. Thick black smoke rolled upward into the winter sky while church bells began ringing frantically across town. "They set the building on fire," Margaret whispered in horror. Caleb was already moving. He sprinted through the snow toward town with Ghost beside him despite her injury. The old candle shop burned like a torch against the darkness. Flames devoured the upper windows, while townspeople gathered helplessly along the alley entrance. Fire trucks struggled to force through the narrow streets buried in snow. Caleb shoved through the crowd. "Get back!" someone yelled. He ignored them. The front half of the building still stood. Barely. The underground chamber beneath it remained directly below the collapsing floor, and all the evidence was still down there. Ghost suddenly lunged forward, barking furiously toward the alley behind the building. Caleb followed her gaze. One of Boone's men, running, trying to escape through the smoke and snow. Ghost took off instantly. "Ghost!" Too late. The German shepherd slammed into the man hard enough to knock him into the frozen alley wall. The man screamed and tried shoving her away, but Ghost held him pinned despite the pain tearing through her injured shoulder. Caleb reached them seconds later. He grabbed the man by the coat collar and slammed him against the bricks. "Who ordered this?" The man struggled wildly. "You're dead if Boone finds out I talked." That answer was enough. Caleb tightened his grip harder. "How many men were buried in those tunnels?" The man's face twisted in panic. "I don't know. Boone's father sealed the north side after the collapse." "Alive?" The man looked away. That silence answered everything. Rage hit Caleb so hard his vision narrowed. Ghost growled beside him. The alley glowed orange from the burning shop. Dozens of veterans, buried alive beneath Briar Glen, because powerful men wanted silence. The attacker suddenly spoke again through shaking breaths. "There's another tunnel entrance beneath the church basement. Boone's men are trying to destroy everything tonight." Then headlights swept into the alley. A black truck stopped hard near the crowd. Travis Boone stepped out slowly into the falling snow. Caleb's eyes locked onto him instantly. For several seconds, neither man moved. The fire crackled loudly between them. Boone's expression remained calm despite the chaos surrounding the street. "You should have left this alone," Boone said quietly. Caleb shoved the attacker toward the ground. "You buried soldiers down there." Boone's face hardened slightly. "My father made difficult choices during a storm. You sealed men underground." The townspeople nearby fell silent hearing the accusation. Snow drifted heavily around them. Boone stepped closer. "You don't understand what those tunnels became. Violence, addiction, dangerous men hiding beneath the town." Caleb's jaw tightened. "They were veterans." Boone stared back coldly. "They were liabilities." The word hit harder than the fire itself. Ghost barked furiously. Several people in the crowd looked visibly shaken now. Margaret Doyle emerged from the smoke carrying Evelyn's journal tightly against her chest. "I heard enough," she said loudly. Boone's expression shifted immediately. Margaret held up the journal. She wrote everything down. Whispers spread through the crowd. The sheriff pushed through moments later with firefighters behind him. "What the hell is happening here?" Margaret turned toward him slowly. "The truth." Boone looked around the street carefully, realizing the situation was slipping away. Then suddenly, part of the candle shop roof collapsed inward with a violent shower of sparks. The crowd screamed and stumbled backward. Ghost barked sharply toward the building. Caleb looked up. The underground chamber. The fire would destroy everything still hidden below. Without hesitation, he ran toward the burning doorway. "Caleb!" Margaret shouted. Ghost followed instantly. Inside, smoke swallowed the shop almost completely. Flames crawled across ceiling beams, while burning wax dripped down the walls like glowing amber rain. Caleb wrapped his sleeve across his mouth and forced himself toward the wax vat. The limestone slab beneath it remained partially exposed, still open. The underground chamber below glowed faintly beneath rising smoke. Ghost suddenly grabbed Caleb's sleeve hard. The ceiling groaned above them. Another collapse was coming. But Caleb saw it. One final box still sitting beside the underground stairs, untouched by fire. Letters, photographs, proof. He dropped through the opening and grabbed the box seconds before the floor above exploded downward behind him. Flames roared overhead. Ghost barked wildly. Caleb climbed back upward through smoke, carrying the evidence against his chest. The entire front room collapsed just as they reached the doorway. Firefighters pulled them both clear into the snow, while the remaining roof caved inward behind them completely. The crowd stood frozen, watching the old candle shop burn against the winter sky. Caleb collapsed to one knee, breathing hard. Ghost pressed against his side, trembling with exhaustion. But alive. Still alive. The sheriff stared at the smoking box Caleb carried from the fire. "What's in there?" Caleb looked toward Travis Boone, then slowly opened the lid. Inside sat military dog tags, photographs, letters, and the names of forgotten veterans Briar Glen buried beneath the mountain. The truth had finally reached daylight, and nothing in that town would ever stay buried again. Snow continued falling across Briar Glen, while the remains of the old candle shop smoldered against the night sky. Steam hissed from blackened beams as firefighters sprayed the last stubborn flames beneath collapsing rafters. Nobody in the crowd spoke much anymore. The military dog tags resting inside Caleb Mercer's burned wooden box had silenced the town more effectively than any accusation ever could. Names, units, dates, proof. The forgotten dead had finally come home. Ghost sat pressed against Caleb's leg beneath the flashing emergency lights, her bandaged shoulder trembling slightly from exhaustion. Soot darkened her fur while melted snow dripped from both of them onto the frozen pavement. Across the alley, Travis Boone stood surrounded by deputies near the sheriff's truck. For the first time since Caleb arrived in Briar Glen, Boone no longer looked untouchable. He looked old. The sheriff held Evelyn Holloway's journal tightly in gloved hands while reading several pages beneath the truck lights. His jaw tightened more with every line. Finally, he looked toward Boone. "You knew about this?" Boone's face remained calm. "My father handled things differently back then." "That's not an answer." Boone stared toward the burning shop. "You think people wanted those tunnels reopened?" he asked quietly. "The drugs? The violence? The bodies?" Margaret Doyle stepped forward immediately. "They were veterans." Boone looked at her coldly. "They were damaged men." Caleb rose slowly to his feet. So was every soldier who ever came home from war. The silence that followed settled hard across the snowy street. Several older townspeople lowered their eyes, because deep down, they knew. Maybe not every detail, but enough to understand what their silence had cost. The sheriff closed the journal firmly. "We're opening an official investigation." Boone's expression finally cracked slightly around the edges. "You dig this up publicly, Briar Glen dies with it." "No," Margaret said softly. "It survives." The wind shifted through the alley, carrying the scent of smoke and burned wax into the mountains beyond town. Ghost leaned briefly against Caleb's leg, grounding him again. Always grounding him. 3 weeks later, snow still covered most of Briar Glen, but the town no longer felt frozen. Construction crews worked daily around the remains of the candle shop, clearing debris and reinforcing the surviving stone foundation. The underground chambers beneath the railroad district had become an active recovery site, overseen by state investigators and veteran organizations. The story spread quickly. Forgotten Vietnam veterans buried beneath a mountain town, a hidden underground sanctuary, a candle maker who tried to save them. News crews arrived first, then historians, then veterans. Old men wearing faded service caps began appearing quietly around town, carrying photographs of brothers, cousins, friends who disappeared decades earlier. Some cried openly when the recovered dog tags were identified. Some simply stood silently beneath the snow, staring at the tunnel entrances. Caleb avoided cameras whenever possible. He spent most days rebuilding. The fire destroyed much of the upper floor, but the original limestone walls still stood stubborn against winter weather. Volunteers from town arrived almost daily now, carrying lumber, tools, coffee, food. People who once ignored the shop now worked side by side repairing it. Guilt had a way of turning into action when truth finally surfaced. Ghost had become something close to a local legend. Children stopped asking permission before petting her anymore. Veterans knelt beside her quietly, like meeting another soldier. Even injured, she stayed close to the rebuilding site every day, watching workers move through the snow-covered alley. Caleb noticed the change in her too. The constant tension had eased. She slept deeply again. Sometimes beneath the afternoon sunlight, stretched beside the shop foundation, with snowflakes resting across her fur. For the first time in years, Caleb started sleeping too. Not perfectly. The nightmares still came, but softer now, less often. And when they did, Ghost always woke him before the panic fully swallowed him whole. One afternoon, Margaret arrived carrying a weathered cardboard box beneath her arm. "You're ready for these," she said. Caleb wiped sawdust from his hands. Inside the box sat Evelyn Holloway's original candle molds, carefully polished, restored. Alongside them rested several surviving jars of preserved beeswax recovered from the underground chamber. Golden, untouched. Caleb stared at them quietly. "They survived the fire?" Margaret nodded. "So did you." The words landed deeper than she probably realized. That evening, Caleb worked alone inside the partially rebuilt shop, while snow drifted quietly beyond the windows. The new roof still smelled of fresh pine. Warm lantern light flickered against limestone walls blackened slightly by smoke. Ghost rested nearby, watching him. Caleb carefully melted the preserved beeswax for the first time. The scent filled the room immediately. Warm honey, cedar, lavender, peace. For a moment, the entire shop seemed to breathe again. He understood then why Evelyn protected this place so fiercely. Not because candles mattered, because healing did. Caleb dipped the wicks slowly, steadily. The rhythm returned almost instantly. Heat, lift, wait, repeat. Outside, Briar Glen settled beneath deep winter silence. Inside, candlelight glowed softly across the restored workshop. When the first finished candle finally cooled completely, Caleb held it beneath the lantern light. Smooth, balanced, strong. Ghost stood and approached quietly. Caleb smiled faintly. "Better than the first one." Ghost's tail tapped once against the floor. A week later, the memorial ceremony drew more people than Briar Glen had seen in decades. Veterans arrived from across North Carolina and Tennessee. Families carried old photographs through the snow toward the restored rail chamber beneath town. The recovered remains had finally been identified. Names long buried beneath silence now echoed publicly through the mountains. Candles lined the underground memorial walls. Dozens of them. Handmade by Caleb using Evelyn's original molds. At the center of the chamber, beneath soft amber light, a bronze plaque now read, "For the men who were never meant to be forgotten." Ghost walked calmly beside Caleb through the crowd, while veterans quietly reached down to touch her scarred shoulder. One old Marine stopped beside her and whispered softly, "Good dog." Ghost leaned gently against his hand. Caleb stood near the memorial entrance afterward, watching people move through the restored tunnels. Not hiding anymore. Remembering. Margaret joined him quietly. "You rebuilt more than a shop," she said. Caleb looked around slowly. The underground chambers no longer felt haunted. They felt honored. "I think Evelyn did most of the work," he answered. Margaret smiled faintly. "No, she just kept the light on long enough for someone else to find it." That night, the rebuilt candle shop officially reopened. A new wooden sign hung above the entrance now. Silent Watch Candles. Warm light glowed through the front windows across fresh snow covering the alley. Inside, shelves held rows of handmade candles wrapped carefully in brown paper and twine. Veterans drank coffee near the stove while townspeople moved quietly through the shop, speaking softer than usual, like entering a church. Ghost lay near the front counter, watching snow fall beyond the glass. Caleb stood behind the workbench, pouring fresh wax into molds, when the bell above the door rang softly. The sheriff entered carrying a small envelope. "Thought you should have this." Caleb opened it carefully. Inside sat an old black and white photograph recovered from the collapsed tunnel. Young Thomas Mercer stood beside Evelyn Holloway and several Vietnam veterans outside the candle shop during winter, and beside them sat a German shepherd. Ghost nudged Caleb's hand gently. Caleb stared at the photograph for a long moment, then finally smiled. Not the guarded half-smiles he used to force for strangers. A real one. Small, tired, but honest. Outside, snow continued falling softly across Briar Glen. Inside the candle shop, warm light filled every corner of the room. And for the first time since coming home from war, Caleb Mercer no longer felt lost. Winter settled gently over Briar Glen during the months that followed. Snow softened the mountains surrounding town, while smoke curled peacefully from chimneys each evening. The railroad district no longer felt abandoned now. Warm light glowed from restored storefronts, and people lingered longer beneath the street lamps instead of rushing home before dark. At the end of the alley, the candle shop stood glowing against the cold, like a lighthouse buried in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Silent Watch Candles. The front windows shined amber every night, and somehow people always found their way there. Veterans came first. Old Marines with shaking hands. Former Army medics carrying memories too heavy to explain. Navy corpsmen who still woke up at 3 a.m. reaching for ghosts that no one else could see. Some stayed only long enough for coffee and warmth. Others sat for hours beside the iron stove listening to the soft crackle of firewood while Caleb worked quietly at the candle bench. Nobody pressured anyone to talk. That was part of why the place mattered. The silence itself felt safe. Ghost became the heart of the shop without meaning to. Children greeted her first every morning before school. Travelers knelt beside her near the front counter, while snow melted from their boots onto the floorboards. Veterans rested rough hands against the scar on her shoulder, like touching proof that survival still existed. She accepted all of it calmly, patiently, like she understood broken people better than most humans ever could. One afternoon, a young veteran named Tyler arrived carrying a backpack and nowhere else to go. Early 20s, hollow-eyed. The same 1,000-yard stare Caleb used to see in mirrors. Tyler barely spoke. He sat near the stove, trembling quietly, while snow fell outside. Ghost walked over immediately. Without hesitation, the German shepherd rested her head against the young man's knee. Tyler broke down crying almost instantly. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just years of pressure finally cracking open all at once. Caleb didn't interrupt. He simply placed a warm cup of coffee beside the kid and returned to his workbench. Because sometimes the greatest kindness wasn't fixing someone. It was letting them fall apart safely. The rebuilt underground memorial beneath the town became a place people traveled across states to see. Candles burned there day and night now beside the recovered dog tags and photographs of the lost veterans. Families finally had answers. Names finally had graves. The mountain had given them back. Even the town itself seemed different now. Lighter somehow. Less afraid of its own history. Margaret Doyle often visited in the evenings after the library closed. She would sit beside the stove grading old volunteer paperwork while Caleb worked quietly nearby. One snowy night, she looked around the glowing shop and smiled softly. Evelyn would have loved this. Caleb carefully dipped another wick into warm wax. I think she planned it. Margaret raised an eyebrow. She left everything waiting, Caleb said quietly. The journals, the molds, the tunnels. He glanced toward Ghost sleeping beside the fire. Even the dog tags somehow found their way home. Margaret watched him for a long moment. You still think it was coincidence you ended up here? Caleb looked toward the front windows where snow drifted beneath the streetlights. No, and he meant it. Because deep down, some part of him now believed the candle shop had been waiting, not for a buyer, for someone broken enough to understand why it mattered. Christmas arrived quietly in Briar Glen. The town square glowed with white lights while fresh snow covered rooftops like folded blankets beneath the stars. Choir music drifted softly from the church near Main Street. Inside silent watch candles, warmth wrapped around every corner of the room. Rows of handmade candles lined the shelves now. Cedar, pine, honey lavender, Appalachian smoke. Each label carried a small inscription beneath the logo, for those finding their way home. Ghost slept beneath the front window, while customers moved quietly through the shop around her. Caleb stood at the workbench finishing the final candle order of the evening when Margaret appeared carrying a small wooden crate. I found this during the archive cleanup, she said softly. Caleb opened the crate carefully. Inside sat the final sealed jar of preserved beeswax, Evelyn Holloway left hidden underground. Golden, untouched. He stared at it silently. For months he avoided opening it. Something about the jar felt sacred. Margaret smiled faintly. I think she meant for you to use it. The shop slowly emptied as snow deepened outside. Eventually, only Caleb and Ghost remained. The old clock above the stove ticked softly beneath the warm glow of lantern light. Caleb finally carried the jar to the workbench. Ghost lifted her head immediately, watching. Carefully, Caleb broke the seal. The scent filled the room at once. Honey, cedar, winter smoke, and something impossible to explain beneath all of it. Home. He melted the wax slowly using Evelyn's oldest iron pot while snow drifted endlessly outside the windows. The rhythm returned naturally now. Heat. Wait. Pour. Steady hands. Steady breathing. The war inside him no longer screamed the way it once had. The memories still existed. Always would. But they no longer owned every quiet moment. Ghost rose slowly and walked beside him. Caleb reached down automatically, scratching behind her ears, while the final candle cooled inside Evelyn's original brass mold. Neither rushed the process. Some things deserved patience. At last, the candle hardened completely. Caleb lifted it carefully beneath the lantern light. Perfect. Smooth ivory wax with faint gold undertones glowing softly against the darkness. Then he noticed it. A small inscription carved beneath the base of the mold itself. Words hidden there all along. Caleb turned the candle slowly and read them aloud. For the soldier who survives long enough to come home. The room went completely still. Ghost rested against his leg quietly. Caleb stared at the inscription while something deep inside him finally gave way. Not violently, not dramatically, just years of grief loosening their grip all at once. His father survived these tunnels. Evelyn survived long enough to leave the truth behind. The forgotten veterans were finally remembered, and somehow, against every expectation, Caleb survived too. A sound escaped him then, half laugh, half broken breath. He lowered himself slowly into the chair beside the window, while tears finally came without resistance. Ghost climbed beside him carefully, despite her age and injuries, resting her head across his lap exactly the way she had 100 times before. Only now Caleb understood something he never could before. Healing wasn't becoming who you were before the damage. Healing was learning you were still worthy of peace afterward. Outside, snow continued falling across Briar Glen beneath silent mountain skies. Inside the candle shop, warm amber light glowed against the glass, while the final candle burned steadily in the front window. Travelers passing through town would later say the shop never seemed to go dark anymore, no matter the storm, no matter the season. And maybe that was fitting, because some lights aren't meant to guide people home quickly. Some lights simply stay on long enough for broken souls to believe home is still possible. Ghost sighed softly in her sleep beside the fire. Caleb rested one hand gently against her fur, while the candle flame flickered warmly in the window. And for the first time in his life, coming home no longer felt impossible. If you believe every veteran deserves a place where they're remembered and never abandoned, comment "home" below. And if a loyal dog has ever carried you through your darkest days, drop a 1 for Ghost. Subscribe and stay with us for more stories about courage, second chances, and the people who refuse to give up when life tries to bury them.